All right, good afternoon. Everybody's ready, transitioning. So we're gonna talk about designing historical narratives, and we're gonna talk about it from a perspective of, I would say, three positions. All right, so when I say three positions, it's going to be based on my identity as to where I sit, how I'm situated in my journey to coming to this particular spot where I'm standing in front of you all and looking at this beautiful presentation. All right, so designing historical narratives is something that was birthed out of basically, we have a big problem in Florida. And being someone who is a teacher, I am a teacher by trade. My background is teaching. I am an educator. So if we have any educators in the house, I salute you. I salute you. And then from being an educator, I actually have a background in media studies and media analysis, and theater is my background, which moved over into educational and social change when I started studying how can we actually make impact in more spaces than just what's happening in the classroom. How are we looking at all of these different modalities? And when the pandemic hit, we had to figure it out and figure it out on the fly. And being a teacher who was already immersed in technology, being a television production teacher, a media analysis teacher, it was easy for me to just flip into the different modalities that would actually help my students evolve. But that wasn't the same for my literacy teachers. My literacy teachers were struggling. My literacy teachers were basically pulling their hair out 25 years in the game, and they were like, I am ready to retire. I'm quitting. I don't want to do this. And it was simply just hit mute on Zoom that was causing all of the frustration. And I felt for them. And so one of my students said to me, Miss Brown, every student needs a Miss Brown's class. And I said, well, why is that? Because I use technology. It was simple for them. It was connective to them. It was something that they actually knew that they can see every day and have in their regular practice. So that led me to becoming a researcher. I jumped out of the classroom and decided to go to University of Miami and pursue my PhD in language and literacy in multilingual settings through technology. I look at all literacy forms through the aspects of technology, studying culture and identity through these particular aspects, which led me down the road of looking at becoming a historian and seeing how does cultural community culture actually embody one's identity. And then how do we do it through affinity spaces? How do we take it out of the classroom? How do we actually employ it in visual spaces? How do we employ it in virtual spaces? And in this case, how do we employ it in game spaces? So we're gonna start with a student from my class. His name is Malik. Malik is a kid who loved coming to Miss Brown's class. Why did he love Miss Brown's class? Because Miss Brown's class had the computers. And once you were done with your work, you could play games. Not that I was just so against them not playing, but you're done with your work, let's have some fun. But Malik struggled with the reading test. Malik always came in and said, ever since I was in third grade, they told me that I wasn't a good reader. Malik struggled with passing the standardized assessment. And I felt for Malik. And this is a true story. But Malik would also tell me every day, excited at how he's mastered a new level in game. And I would say, you probably should have been doing your homework instead of playing that game. And that's what the average teacher would say. But after I got past that, I would say, what game are you playing? I would get curious. And he would get excited. Oh, I'm playing Assassin's Creed. Oh, Miss Brown, you should have seen me. I had to make a decision. I had to go down the now. I had to read the compass. And I'm sitting here listening to the student light up and explore history, culture, mathematics, geographic. He's reading everything that's happening in this screen. And I could not believe, and they're telling me you can't pass a reading test? You are reading at a high level. He was a sixth grader. I was a middle school teacher at the time. And at the time, the game he was playing was written at a 12th grade reading level. So I couldn't understand, how can Malik not pass a reading test? How is he struggling with a reading test and he's reading every day in this game? So it got me thinking when I got into the research world, what really is literacy? What are we really considering literacy to be? How are we looking at literacy? How are we looking at the cultural dynamics of literacy? How are we looking at what actually happens? Is literacy still the traditional textbook? Well, this was my argument with many of my professors. And it really became many arguments because I didn't believe it. I didn't see literacy being simply just a traditional text. I saw literacy moving into multiple forms. I saw literacy moving into film. I saw literacy moving into media. I saw literacy in games. And so I began to question, what does 21st century literacy look like? What does it actually look like for the future of literacy? And more importantly, how do we actually make sure we are ensuring relevance in what we produce in the literacy forms? So I started to look at Gloria Ladson-Bullen's work. And what does it mean to be culturally relevant when it comes to literacy? Students love reading. They're reading everything. Text, media, social media, comments. They are embedded and engulfed and immersed in reading on a regular basis. It's not in your traditional text form, but they are reading. And the problem is, when they do look at traditional texts, many of the texts don't represent who they are. It doesn't look like them. They don't see them in these same forms of designs of what we call the traditional textbook. So they become bored, disengaged. They don't want to do it. And you simply have this child that's now sitting in your classroom who becomes the one who sits to Ms. Brown's class, and they say, well, why are you here? I was disrupting the class. Well, what were you doing? I was sleeping. How was that disrupting? You were asleep. That's not disrupting, like you were peaceful. But this happens because the student is bored. There's nothing engaging them in that classroom. So this is setting up our problem when it comes to literacy. We have a literacy issue in the US. We have a huge literacy issue. And it's not just for one demographic, it's for all students. We have a huge literacy issue with our teachers. Why? Because most teachers do not have digital identity. They do not have technology identity. They are struggling when it comes to actually applying this into their land masses and their frameworks. So I started looking at what actually happens in games. And the reason I chose gaming is because I had studied media for so long. I saw gaming as the one space where sound, media, graphics, excitement, and this intrinsic motivation to do one thing over and over again happens. Failure. Students would fail over and over again in games and get right back at it. And that became something I was curious about. How did they accept failure so easily and then get excited to figure out, how do I get to the next level? How did they analyze? How did they strategize? What were they identifying in the games that made them actually say, I want to play this game? So I started to look at how game built identity. I started to look at the fact that students no longer identified themselves as students when they played games. They identified themselves as gamers. And we have other forms of streamers. But these are new identities that are developing right before our eyes that we are missing a huge opportunity to employ our students with the skills, the encouragement, and more importantly, just the knowledge that they need in order to move forward into society. Games built identity. But I started to look at what games and what identity was it building. Well, most games was building social identity. They were communicating with many of their friends across the world, and this became community structure. This is something Dr. Kashana Grace speaks about in her books and when she talks about technology influence. It is also the work that they begin to realize that it doesn't matter who I was because the wall always protected me. So I found allies in the gaming design. I found allies in the gaming world that allowed for me to speak to who I truly was as a gamer, not as a student, not my ethnicity, not my culture, but just as a gamer. I could be all I can be as a gamer. And it didn't matter if I failed. Why? Because I just reload some lives. I just figure out how to get the new weapons pack. I figure out how to get the new skills pack. It didn't matter. Gaming became the new identity. And it built the level of identity in our students that many people were looking at and saying, I don't know why they're playing those games. And I was over there saying, let them play the games. Let them play the games. My students did more work in class when they knew the reward and the incentive was, you get to play the game out. And they wasn't just turning in anything. It would be top tier work. Why? Because they knew they was gonna do it over. It became the motivator in my classroom. It became something that I knew could actually change, not just how they saw my work, but also how they identified themselves as students in my class. So I started to look at games and the narratives in games. I started to look at identity in games. I started to look at how was representation happening in games. How was students actually harnessing community in games? What were they building in these games? This started to bring me to the work of Tara Yoso's Community Cultural Wealth and looking at the different capitals that she looked at: familiar, family, resistance. When I seen the Roblox game the other day and I saw the picture of the student that made the protesters, I looked at it and I said, man, that's resistant. And you're doing it in a game form. I championed that girl. I championed that student. I said, that's what I'm talking about. That's how you do that. Use that modality for your change. We harness community. But not only do we harness community, we harness identity. But how do teachers actually use it? Because I'm a person of praxis. Well, design thinking. Something that simple. How do teachers allow students to build games in the classroom? Well, they start first with becoming researchers. When you become a researcher, you allow your students to research the identity, the cultural ethnicity, the aspect, maybe it's the significant moment, but they have to research it. Once they research it, they pull all of the information down, and from that, they can then move to writing their plot. They move to writing their plot. They move to storyboarding. They move to getting to the spaces and the places of saying, how do I want to actually make this story move forward in my own lived experience? They now have autonomy to be the ones that co-create with the history. They now have the autonomy to be the ones that actually develop the plot. When you develop the plot, they then move to character development. Why do they move to character development? Well, we all want to have a great character with a great superpower. Maybe it's something that allows for them to not just navigate the Underground Railroad, but they get to actually say, how do the Underground Railroad is built and what is along the Underground Railroad? Then I started to look at, okay, well, if the mission they're designing is aligned with what we're actually doing in the community, how can this mission actually motivate them to fail, get back up, and do it again? After the mission design, they needed to move on to dialogue and scripts. How would the characters move the story along? This was the narrative practice. This was the part of the game that many of the students really enjoyed, especially with pop culture language. I had never seen so many linguistic cues moved into gaming and historical narratives. It was like the coolest thing to see them reenact the game process to say, this is how I'm going to make Ida B. Wells speak with current 21st century pop language. And she has to use these different language semiotics in order to move forward. The creativity for them was amazing. They were engaged. They were captivated by it. They saw it as an opportunity to say, you know what, this is my own. They took ownership of it. Then they would get feedback and redesign. And we just kept going through the process. They would get feedback and redesign. Some of the students would stick with the same historical character. One student, he went from Martin Luther King, then he moved over to telling the story from the NCAA president, and then he moved to say, I'm going to tell the story from Mr. Ruffin's perspective. Then he said, you know what? No, I want to tell the story from the president's perspective. It wasn't just about telling the story. They had to navigate it with game praxis, meaning it had to be a mission involved. What are you actually trying to do here? They saw a problem, and they said, we're going to solve this problem. Once they figured out that they could actually be game makers, they realized they had agency. They could create it. They saw themselves as the game developer. Teachers were just facilitating. They were just encouraging. They was ensuring accuracy. And this made the practice of game design and taking historical narratives something that they were able to embody on their own. The historical figures that they were utilizing in gaming were some that most people won't even allow them to read in books. But they played the games with it. They found the workaround. And they said, wow, I didn't know the story can be told from a positive perspective. I didn't know the story could be told from a story of strength and not trauma. They were empowered to be able to do so. They were empowered to be able to design the game and do it where it was inclusive for all. Why? Because there's not just one narrative in game design. There's not just one narrative in any story. We all have stories from our community that we can tell, and we can know, I can tell the story one way, you can tell the story one way, but we both had the same experience. But our narratives change how we actually embody it. And we can design that narrative in our own way. One of the beauties of games is that I love the fact that you can co-create the game with the designer. Why? You get to pick your own character. You get to pick what you wear. You get to pick how you look. You get to pick the setting. You're now co-creating with the person who designed the game. Students need the ability to co-create. I'm from Florida. They're banning books. So I said, let them play. If they can't learn their history through the books, then let them learn it through the game. Let's solve a problem. I didn't see it as a problem. I saw it as an opportunity. Create games that students can learn their own historical narratives. Create games that students can not just learn the historical narrative, but they can have a shared experience by learning the narrative from multiple perspectives. They can learn it from everyone's perspective who was involved. Why? Because everyone has value in the history. Everyone has value in the identity of our history. Everyone has a shared interest in our history. So my rule is simple, my class. Let them play. I don't care. Because they're going to come back and share with me everything they experienced through that game. I went to the talk this morning with Tracy and Matthew, and when they wrote the book on the well-played game, I was like, this speaks to the fact that students should play more. But they shouldn't just play more. They should be taught how to design what they play. My name is Mistoria Brown. You can connect with me. You can follow my work. You can collaborate with me and be an ally in this journey in Florida. And let's design some games that every student has the opportunity to not just play, but they actually have an opportunity to see themselves in the game, from past to present. Thank you. Questions?
Anybody have any questions? I can bring you the microphone.
Test. All right. Thank you so much. That was super inspiring to hear. About Malik's story, do you think there can also be games could be an opportunity to detect neurodivergence in students? Because I was diagnosed with dyslexia at 31, and I only came to get to a diagnosis after writing 1,000,000 words for a book. So as a kid, I struggled with reading a lot as well. I was very successful with games, but I had a similar issue. Do you think games can then also let people discover themselves and their other challenges that are more on the neurodivergent level?
I say yes. I don't see them as challenges. I see them as superpowers. I always tell my student when they have identified their new superpower, be it dyslexia, ADHD, it's a superpower. It's a way that allows for your brain to challenge information. And I do believe games have the opportunity to do that. Games, a lot of times they feel are very super exposed to causing you to not be able to identify those things. But games are the one thing that allows for individuals, be it young or old, to focus, not just on the information, but on the details of the information. And I do believe there are testing sources that can actually help support that, and it could be a well-designed game. And I believe it will be a great resource to any school counselor or guidance counselor or social worker in any school setting that will actually allow them to actually test with authenticity.
Other questions?
You walk all the way up. Thank you so much. That's a really inspiring talk. I love what you said about, the books got banned and so you let them play, right? And the concept of that. So I run a game studio in Africa, in Kenya. And one thing that we're really struggling with at the moment is that a couple of the recent games that have come out internationally with African historical stories, the most recent one, Relooted, about the artworks that have been taken to the museums around the world, are just facing a deluge of hate and racism, frankly, in the comments upon launch. And in conversations today with people about this, people say, well, maybe just don't make African stories, like, because they still need to make a living and they still want to like make games. So maybe just tone down the African bit. And that feels so wrong to me. And so I wanted to kind of get your thoughts of like, how do you face that? How do you tell an authentic story, recognizing that it may mean your career?
First, I would say you could tell an authentic story when you're working with the people that are connected to the story. That's one. Telling the story from a third person perspective is, you can do that, but you should make sure that your allies are connected to the people who have actually lived the experience, or they're connected to that experience. I would say that. Everyone needs to hear an African story because it is an origin story. It is an origin stories that connect all of us. And I think the biggest thing is, and this is my answer, when people say, well, why do you want to tell stories about Black history? And I say, well, because I think it's time we stop telling the story from a traumatic perspective. I think the stories have for so long been told from the trauma and not the strength of those who actually participated. We look at it from a perspective of the deficit and not from the perspective of the heroines. They are heroes. And this is not just the African Americans, but those who are actually allies and things of that nature. So I think when you allow for the different perspectives to be told, it gives a narrative that allows for everybody to see themselves through the game and see themselves in the story. And I think that's just the only thing. One person doesn't want to see themselves in the story as the villain, but the same person can't keep being the villain every time in the story. So I think it's time to change that narrative.